Grief doesn't get a vote in this house anymore, old man. Camille said it without looking up from the box she was taping shut, and for 3 full seconds nobody in that kitchen moved. The refrigerator kept humming behind her like nothing had happened. A drop of coffee kept sliding down the side of my mug and hit the counter with a small, ordinary sound. My son Daniel kept staring at his phone, and I understood in that moment that he had heard this sentence before, more than once, and had simply stopped flinching at it. I was the only one in the room who still flinched. I stood there holding a dish towel like a man holding the last wall of a house that was already coming down, and I thought, she just spoke about my wife, the way you'd speak about a stain that finally came out of the carpet. My name is Arthur Kessler. I am 62 years old, and for 38 years I ran a small photography studio 2 blocks off Cedar Street, restoring wedding albums that fire had eaten, and portraits that water had ruined, and faces that time had tried to erase. I spent my whole career learning how to save an image nobody else thought could be saved. I never imagined the hardest restoration of my life would be my own family, and I never imagined the first photograph I'd have to fight to save would be the last one my wife ever touched. Eleanor had been gone for 14 months. A fall down the basement stairs on a Tuesday afternoon, the county coroner's report said, blunt trauma, accidental, case closed within a week. I had accepted that report the way you accept a diagnosis from a doctor you trust completely, without asking a single hard question, because some sentences are too heavy to test. I buried my wife of 36 years, and I let my son and his wife move into managing what was left of our life, because Camille had gone to school for exactly this, she said. Estate administration, family office structuring. She had a certification and a calm, capable voice, and grief makes you very willing to hand your keys to anyone who sounds capable. That was the last box, Camille said now, snapping the tape gun shut. 23 boxes in 6 weeks. She had gone through the house like a contractor, clearing a condemned building. The hallway frames first, then the mantel, then the shoeboxes in the hall closet that Eleanor had filled for 40 years with prints from 100 different Kodak drugstores. Camille called it decluttering. She called it healing. She stood in my kitchen with packing tape stuck to her sleeve and told me, not unkindly, that keeping a house wallpapered in a dead woman's face wasn't grief. It was hoarding, and that Mia didn't need to grow up in a shrine. I want to tell you that I said something back to her that afternoon. I didn't. I am, by nature, a patient man, the kind of man people mistake for weak because he doesn't raise his voice. The kind who spent 4 decades bent over a light table fixing other people's disasters instead of causing his own. I had given up my studio's back room twice for free to grieving families who couldn't pay. I had worked Christmas mornings restoring a soldier's last photograph home before his funeral, no charge, because some things shouldn't have a price tag. Camille knew none of that about me. To her, I was just an old man standing in a kitchen holding a dish towel, and for a moment, God help me, I almost believed she was right. Then Mia found the photograph, and everything I thought I knew about my wife's death came apart in my hands. It was 2 nights later, past 10 o'clock, when I heard the soft click of the guest room door and small bare feet on the hallway floor. My granddaughter is 9 years old, sharp-eyed, and quiet in the particular way of children who have learned to watch adults very closely without being noticed. She stood in my bedroom doorway, in her pajamas holding something flat against her chest like she was smuggling it across a border. And when she saw me sitting up in the dark, she didn't say hello. She said, "Grandpa." I wasn't supposed to keep this. She held it out. A 5x7 print, one corner scorched brown and curling, the surface still faintly bitter with the smell of the fireplace. It was Eleanor, 30 years younger, standing in front of a lake house I didn't recognize, laughing at something outside the frame. I had never seen it in my life, and in 38 years of restoring photographs for strangers, I had learned to read a print the way a doctor reads an X-ray. This one had things wrong with it that shouldn't have been wrong. "Mommy was burning them in the fireplace," Mia whispered. "The ones from the boxes in the garage." She said Grandma's things needed to go somewhere warm now instead of sitting in the dark. I took this one out of the fire before it caught all the way. I hid it under my mattress for 2 days. I wasn't supposed to see it, Grandpa. I wasn't supposed to see what's on the back. I turned it over with hands that had gone very still, the particular stillness I only get when I already suspect something is about to be true. There, in Eleanor's handwriting, small, slanted, unmistakably hers, was a single line of ink that had survived the fire because someone, at some point, had laminated the back with a thin protective film, the kind I myself had taught her to use 30 years ago to keep ink from fading. 9 words. Just 9 words, dated 11 days before she died. If anything happens to me, ask Arthur about the safe deposit box. I sat on the edge of my bed at 10:40 at night, holding a photograph my daughter-in-law had tried to burn, reading a sentence my dead wife had written to be found only if she was already gone, and I understood. The way you understand a structural crack has been growing behind fresh paint for years before you ever see it, that Eleanor Kessler had not simply fallen down a flight of stairs. She had known something was coming. And someone in this house had spent 14 months making very sure that nobody would ever have a reason to ask about a safe deposit box, because they had spent those 14 months burning every photograph that might have a message written on the back. I want to be honest with you about who I was before that night, because it matters for what comes after. I was not a suspicious man. I was not the kind of husband who checked his wife's phone, or the kind of father who audited his son's finances. I had spent my whole career trusting that if you looked closely enough and patiently enough, you could always find the truth hiding under the damage, but I had never once turned that instinct on my own family, because you don't restore a photograph of someone you love. You just love it, damage and all, and you never think to ask what's underneath. That ended the night my granddaughter stood in my doorway with a photograph she was never supposed to see. I didn't sleep. I sat at the small desk in my bedroom with a magnifying loupe I hadn't used since I closed the studio, turning the print over and over under my desk lamp, and the longer I looked, the less any of it made sense as an accident. The photograph itself had been taken with a camera Eleanor never owned, at a lake house I'd never heard her mention in 36 years of marriage, and on the back, beneath her handwriting, there was a second, fainter set of marks, a partial fingerprint pressed into the laminate before it had fully cured, decades old. Not hers, not mine. Someone else had handled this photograph before it was ever put in a box in our garage. Someone had known, long before Camille ever picked up a packing tape gun, that this particular print was dangerous enough to be worth hiding at the bottom of an old shoebox rather than a frame on the wall. I didn't know it yet, but that scorched corner in my hand was the first loose thread in a rope that would eventually hang 3 people. I told Mia gently that she'd done exactly the right thing, and that this had to stay a secret between the 2 of us for now. The way grown-ups sometimes keep secrets to keep the people they love safe. She nodded like she already understood that better than most adults do. I walked her back to bed, and then I stood alone in the hallway outside the room that used to be Eleanor's sewing room and was now Camille's home office, and I looked at the closed door the way I used to look at a badly water-damaged negative. Not with despair, but with the specific patient hunger of a man who has just realized there might be something worth saving underneath the ruin after all. The next morning I did something I am not proud of, and would do again without hesitation. I waited until Camille left for her 9 o'clock call with a client, and Daniel left for the office, and I let myself into that sewing room with the spare key I'd had cut for the house 30 years ago, back when it was still mine to walk through without asking permission. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking the way I always looked at a damaged print before I understood what had damaged it. Slowly, without assumptions, cataloging what didn't belong. What didn't belong was a small fireproof lockbox sitting in the bottom drawer of Camille's desk, half hidden under a stack of client folders, newer than anything else in the room, its key nowhere in sight. What didn't belong was a burn barrel out behind the garage that hadn't been there 18 months ago, ash still faintly visible in its bottom, despite a hard rain the week before. What didn't belong, more than anything, was the fact that in 6 weeks of clearing out the sadness, Camille had emptied every shoebox, every hallway frame, every album on the mantel, Every single photograph of Eleanor in this house except the ones already digitized on my own laptop, which she had no access to, and, I now understood with a cold certainty settling into my chest, clearly didn't know existed. I am a patient man. I had spent 38 years learning that you never rush a restoration, that the fastest way to destroy a damaged photograph forever is to scrub at it before you understand what you're looking at. So I did not confront Camille that morning. I did not call Daniel and demand an explanation. I put the lockbox back exactly where I found it. I locked the sewing room door behind me, and I drove into town to see the only man I trusted enough to help me find out what my wife had known before she died. A man who had spent 30 years reading fraud out of insurance photographs long before I ever met him, and who owed me a favor from a fire investigation neither of us had ever spoken about since. His name is Ray Doyle, and he was about to become the second person in this story who understood, before anyone else did, that Eleanor Kessler had left a message meant to be found only after she was already gone. Ray Doyle's office was a converted garage behind his house on the edge of town, walls lined with filing cabinets and a single overhead light that buzzed faintly, the kind of place that looked like nothing important could happen in it, which was exactly why important things happened there. He was 68, built like a man who'd spent 30 years hauling equipment instead of sitting behind a desk, with a gray mustache he chewed on when he was thinking and eyes that had spent 3 decades finding the one wrong detail in 10,000 right ones. We'd met 20 years ago on an insurance fraud case, a warehouse fire, a claim built on photographs that didn't match their own shadows, and I was the photo examiner who'd caught it. Ray was the investigator who'd trusted a stranger's word over 3 lawyers telling him he was wrong. He'd never forgotten it. Neither had I. I set the scorched photograph down on his workbench without a word. He picked it up, turned it toward the light, and went very quiet in the particular way careful men go quiet when they already suspect they're not going to like what they find. "Where," he said finally, "did this come from?" "My granddaughter pulled it out of a fireplace 2 nights ago. My daughter-in-law was burning boxes of my late wife's photographs," said she was clearing out the sadness. Ray didn't answer right away. He turned the print over, studied the 9 words in Eleanor's handwriting, studied the faint partial print pressed into the laminate beneath them, and then he did something that told me everything about how seriously he was taking this. He pulled on a pair of cotton gloves before he touched it again. 14 months since she passed," he said. "And somebody's still burning photographs. That's not decluttering, Arthur. Decluttering happens in the first 6 weeks, when the grief's still raw and everybody wants the house to stop hurting. 14 months out, and you're still working through boxes in the garage, like there's something in there you need gone before somebody else finds it. That's not sadness. That's a cleanup crew." I told him about the lockbox in the sewing room. I told him about the burn barrel behind the garage. I told him about the safe deposit box Eleanor's note had pointed me toward, one I had never in 36 years known existed, in a bank I didn't even bank with. Ray wrote none of it down. He listened the way he always had, completely still, and when I finished he set the photograph down and looked at me for a long moment. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about the answer instead of defending your family," he said. 14 months ago, when Eleanor died, who found her?" "Camille," I said. "I was at a doctor's appointment. Daniel was at work. Camille had stopped by to drop off some paperwork for Eleanor to sign. A durable power of attorney update," she said. "Something about the family trust. She found her at the bottom of the basement stairs." "And the paperwork," Ray said. "Did Eleanor sign it before she died?" I hadn't thought about that document in over a year. I had to sit with the question for a moment before the memory surfaced, ugly and slow, like something floating up from the bottom of a lake. Camille told me Eleanor had signed it that morning, before the fall. She said it was already witnessed and notarized when she got there. Ray leaned back in his chair, and I watched him do the same thing I'd been doing at my desk lamp at midnight, laying pieces down next to each other, waiting to see if they made a shape. "So your wife updates a power of attorney document that hands significant control to your daughter-in-law And hours later, she's dead at the bottom of a staircase, and the only witness is the person who benefits from the paperwork, he said slowly. And now, over a year later, somebody in that house is still burning every photograph of your wife that might have writing on the back. Arthur, I'm not going to tell you what that adds up to. I'm going to tell you what we need before either of us says the word I know you're already thinking. We needed 3 things, Ray said. We needed the toxicology and physical evidence from Eleanor's original death investigation, not the summary, the raw file, because county coroners in overworked departments rarely dig as deep as they should on a case that looks clean on its face. We needed to know what was actually inside that safe deposit box Eleanor had pointed me toward, and we needed to know it before Camille found any reason to suspect I knew it existed. And we needed to understand what was in that fireproof lockbox in the sewing room, because a woman burning photographs in a fireplace was hiding something she was afraid to shred, afraid to throw away, afraid even to burn completely. She was hiding something she still needed. That last one worries me most, Ray said. People don't keep what they don't still need. Whatever's in that lockbox, she's not done using it yet. I drove home that afternoon with a version of myself I hadn't worn in 14 months settling back into my chest. Not the patient, grieving widower who let his family manage what was left of his life, but the man who used to sit at a light table until 2 in the morning, refusing to accept that a damaged negative was beyond saving. I still had the bank's name from Eleanor's note, tucked inside the property records envelope she kept in her desk. She had renewed a small safe deposit box there every year for as long as I could remember, and I had simply never once asked what she kept in it, the way you never ask what's in your spouse's side of the closet after 36 years. Some trust doesn't need a reason. I understood now that Eleanor's trust in me had needed exactly one reason, and she had left it taped to the back of a photograph, betting correctly that if anyone would ever go looking closely enough to find it, it would be me. The bank required the original box key and identification to access it, and Eleanor had listed me as a co-signer on the account 30 years ago and apparently never removed me. Some marriages fade at the edges over 3 decades. Mine, I understood sitting in that quiet little vault room 2 days later with a bank officer standing discreetly by the door, had not. Inside the box was not money. It was worse and better than money. It was a manila folder, worn soft at the corners from being handled many times, containing photocopied bank statements from an account I had never seen, statements showing withdrawals from the Kessler Family Trust, the one Eleanor and I had established 15 years earlier to protect what remained of my studio's sale proceeds and our modest retirement savings for Daniel. And eventually, Mia, totaling just under $400,000 over 3 years, all authorized under a signature that was unmistakably Camille's, using an authority she should not have had access to until both Eleanor and I were deceased or incapacitated. Beneath the statements was a single sheet of Eleanor's handwriting, longer than the note on the photograph, dated 6 weeks before she died. I have found something I don't fully understand yet, but I don't like what I do understand. Camille has been moving money out of the family trust for years. Small enough not to trigger the accountant's attention, always routed through an account I've never heard of before, tied to a man named Julian Vance. I don't know who he is to her. I only know he isn't family, and I know she's been lying to Daniel about where her weekend trips go. If something happens to me before I finish looking into this, Arthur, please believe I wasn't confused, and please don't let her convince you I was. I sat in that vault room for a long time after I finished reading it, and I understood something about my wife that broke my heart and steadied it at the same time. She had spent the last 6 weeks of her life, quietly, carefully, alone, building a case against the woman who would eventually stand in our kitchen and tell me grief didn't get a vote in my own house. She had done it without telling me, and for one bitter moment I let myself feel the sting of that. 36 years of marriage, and she hadn't trusted me enough to say a word. But I am a photographer. I understand better than most people that sometimes you don't show someone the print until you're certain it's not going to fall apart in their hands. Eleanor hadn't been protecting a secret from me. She'd been protecting me from a half-finished truth The way you don't hand someone a photograph still sitting in developer fluid. She had run out of time to finish it herself. She had left it for me to develop instead. I called Ray that night from my car in the bank parking lot, and I read him the name. Julian Vance, Ray repeated, and I heard him go still on the other end of the line the way he had over the photograph. Arthur, I need you to sit with something for a second before I tell you what I already know about that name, because it's going to change how you look at your daughter-in-law, and I don't think it's the direction you're expecting. Ray had crossed paths with Julian Vance 11 years earlier on a completely unrelated case, a boutique estate planning outfit that specialized in what Vance liked to call family wealth optimization for clients who were elderly, recently widowed, or quietly losing capacity, always structured just carefully enough to survive a light audit. Vance had never been convicted of anything. He had also, Ray said, never once run one of these arrangements without an inside person, a relative, a caregiver, someone with legitimate access and a legitimate reason to be moving paperwork through a family's finances, someone Vance could control through debt, or flattery, or fear, long before that person ever understood what they'd become part of. I don't think your daughter-in-law built this, Ray said quietly. I think somebody built it around her. And by the time she understood what she was standing inside, it was already too late to walk out without burning the whole house down on her own head. That doesn't make her innocent, Arthur. It makes her something worse for you to deal with, because it means there are two people in this, not one, and the second one has done this before and knows exactly how to disappear when it stops working. I drove home past 10 that night with the folder locked in my glove box and a single, cold thought settling into place behind my ribs, that whatever role Camille had played, willingly or otherwise, in draining the trust my wife and I had spent 30 years building, she had also stood at the top of the basement stairs, or very near them, on the last afternoon of Eleanor's life, with a signed power of attorney in her hand and a debt to Julian Vance she couldn't afford for my wife to keep investigating. I want to tell you I confronted her that night. I didn't. Because that same evening, walking past the closed door of the sewing room on my way to bed, I heard her voice through the wood, low and clipped in a way I'd never once heard her use with Daniel, and 3 words stopped me cold in the hallway. He's asking questions. I stood absolutely still, my hand not quite touching the door, and I heard her say it again, quieter, almost pleading. Arthur, he's asking questions about the photographs. I don't know what he found, Julian, but he's not the harmless old man you told me he'd be. I am, above all else, a patient man. I did not open that door. I walked back to my bedroom on socked feet, the way I used to walk a darkroom floor in the dark without ever knocking over a tray, and I sat down at my desk. And for the first time in 14 months, I allowed myself to feel something other than grief in that house. A cold, structural, load-bearing kind of clarity. The exact feeling I used to get right before I found the one crack in a print that explained every other flaw in the image. Eleanor had left me 9 words on the back of a photograph she must have known might be the only thing to survive her. She had trusted that if anything happened to her, I would eventually be patient enough, and stubborn enough, and in love with her enough to find the rest. I had spent 38 years teaching myself never to give up on a damaged image before I understood what had damaged it. I was not going to give up on this one either. The next morning I called Ray before the sun was fully up and told him what I'd overheard through the sewing room door. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that changed the shape of everything that came after. Then it's time we stop reading what's already developed, Arthur, and start capturing what's happening right now. If Vance is still calling this house, if Camille is still scared enough of him to be pleading through a closed door, we need eyes and ears in that room before either of them realizes you know anything at all. And we need the original coroner's file pulled before somebody with Vance's kind of money finds a reason to make it disappear. I looked at the ceiling of my bedroom that morning, at the old smoke detector I'd installed myself 20 years earlier, and I thought about every fire panel and security system I'd ever wired into a client's darkroom to protect 30 years of irreplaceable negatives from a single spark. I had built things to keep precious images safe from damage for most of my adult life, It was time to build something to catch the people trying to erase one. Ray came to the house 2 mornings later disguised as a heating contractor, toolbox and all, and in 90 quiet minutes he did to my hallway smoke detectors exactly what I'd once done to a client's darkroom panel. Hid something essential inside something ordinary. 4 units, wireless, battery-backed, feeding a live encrypted signal to a tablet. Ray kept locked in his truck, one above the kitchen island, one in the front hallway, one angled into the sewing room from the vent grill above the bookshelf, one in the small den where Daniel and Camille had taken to having their late-night conversations with the door shut and the television turned up just loud enough to cover their voices from anyone who wasn't already listening for them. I want to tell you I did this without hesitation, the way Ray did it, the way the man I was 14 months ago might have done it. I didn't. I stood in that hallway watching him work and felt something close to nausea, because installing a hidden camera in your own son's house is not the act of a man who trusts his family, and some part of me, some old, stubborn, sentimental part that had spent 36 years believing love was supposed to be the opposite of surveillance, hated myself for it. I had spent my whole career restoring what fire and water tried to destroy. I had never once used a camera to catch someone in the act of destroying something on purpose. My hands actually shook, screwing the last detector back onto the ceiling, and I had to stop and sit on the stairs for a minute before I trusted myself to finish. Ray didn't say anything about it. He just waited, the way you wait for a man to steady a ladder before he climbs it again. That was the moment. Sitting on my own basement stairs with my hands shaking, staring down at the spot where paramedics had once knelt beside my wife, that I understood something about myself I'd never had to face before. I had not gone down to that basement once, not one single time in 14 months. I told myself it was because we didn't need anything stored down there. The truth was simpler and uglier. I could not make my legs carry me past the 4th step. I sat there that morning with my hand gripping the railing, looking down into a shadow I had avoided for over a year, and I finally admitted to myself what patience had actually been covering for. It wasn't strength. Some of it had just been fear wearing a very calm face. I got up anyway. That, I think, is the only part of it I'm actually proud of. 3 days after the cameras went live, Ray called me at 6 in the morning. His voice flat in a way I'd learned meant he was choosing his words carefully. I got the original coroner's file pulled, Arthur. Full autopsy photographs, not just the summary report. You need to come sit down before I walk you through it. I sat in his converted garage's office an hour later, with coffee going cold in my hands while Ray laid photographs across the workbench. Not photographs Eleanor had taken, but photographs taken of her, clinical and terrible. And I made myself look at everyone because I owed her that much after 14 months of not asking a single hard question. Ray pointed to a magnified detail on the back of the skull, a small localized fracture pattern distinct from the broader trauma consistent with a fall down wooden stairs. This is a contact wound, Ray said quietly. Concentrated, not diffuse. It's consistent with a single blow from a narrow, heavy object, delivered before the fall, not caused by it. The original coroner's report doesn't mention it. Either it was missed, which happens more than anyone wants to admit in an overworked county office looking at a case that seemed clean, or it was never meant to be looked at closely, because there was nothing publicly troubling about a grieving family who didn't request a deeper investigation into an accidental fall. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. Camille found her, alone, with a freshly signed power of attorney in her hand. You're telling me my wife was struck before she went down those stairs, and the only person in the house that afternoon was the same woman who spent 14 months burning every photograph that might have Eleanor's handwriting on the back. I'm telling you what the evidence supports, Ray said. I'm not telling you Camille swung whatever hit her. I'm telling you somebody did, and somebody has spent over a year making very sure nobody ever had a reason to ask. That could be one person. Arthur, given what we heard through that sewing room door, it might be two. I didn't sleep again that week. I sat up most nights with Ray's tablet propped on my desk, watching the 4 small feeds cycle in silence. And on the 4th night, I finally saw something worth the wait. Camille, alone in the den at 11:40, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and raw, in a way the daytime version of her never allowed herself to sound. "You said this would be finished by now," she was saying. "You said once the trust restructuring cleared probate, nobody would ever look at the transfers again. It's been 14 months, Julian. 14 months of burning photographs, like some kind of criminal, because you're afraid one of them has her handwriting on it. I didn't sign up to spend the rest of my life terrified of an old man's granddaughter finding a picture in a shoebox." A pause then, quieter, almost breaking. "I know what I owed you. I know what happens if I stop. I just need you to remember that I have a daughter in this house, Julian. I have a 9-year-old daughter sleeping 30 feet from where you're telling me to be patient." She hung up and sat alone in the dark den for almost 4 minutes without moving, and watching her on that small screen, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward the woman who'd stood in my kitchen and told me grief didn't get a vote in my own house. I felt sorry for her. Not enough to forgive what she'd done. Enough to understand, the way Ray had warned me I eventually would, that there were two very different kinds of guilty people sitting under my roof, and only one of them had walked into this with her eyes open. I called Ray at midnight and told him what I'd heard. "We have motive, we have the trust transfers, we have Vance's name, and now we have her on tape describing exactly the kind of leverage he's holding over her," I said. "Isn't that enough to go to the police?" "It's enough to open an investigation," Ray said. "It's not enough to stop them from destroying whatever's left in that lockbox the second they smell trouble coming. And it's not enough to protect you and Mia if Vance decides an old man asking questions is a bigger liability than an old man staying quiet. We need the contents of that lockbox, Arthur. And we need it documented before we make a single move that tips them off." That opportunity came 4 days later, on a Thursday afternoon when Camille took Mia to a dentist appointment, and Daniel was at the office until 6. I let myself into the sewing room one more time, and this time I didn't stop at cataloging what didn't belong. I pulled the fireproof lockbox out from under the stack of client folders, and using a set of picks I hadn't touched since I helped a locksmith friend train his apprentices 30 years ago, a skill I'd picked up the same decade I learned to restore water-damaged negatives. Because in this life you never know which strange patient skill will end up saving something you love. I had the box open in under 4 minutes. Inside was not evidence of Camille's guilt so much as evidence of her captivity. Bank documents showing a personal debt to a shell entity tracing back to Julian Vance, well over $200,000, dated to a period 2 years before Eleanor's death. A debt Camille had apparently taken on to bail out her own struggling business before she ever married into our family. A debt Vance had then used, patiently, the way a good fisherman uses patience, to reel her into helping restructure the Kessler family trust once he learned, through her, exactly how much an aging couple with no other children had quietly put aside. Beneath the documents was a single burner phone, and beneath that, at the very bottom, an unmailed letter in Camille's own handwriting, dated 8 months earlier, addressed to nobody, the kind of letter you write when you need to say something true to someone, even if that someone is only yourself. "I don't know how to stop this without losing everything," it read. "Daniel doesn't know. Mia can't ever know. I told myself I was only helping Julian move money legally, and then Eleanor found the transfers and started asking questions I couldn't answer, and I don't know what happened on those stairs. I wasn't there when it happened. I only found her after. I swear to God I only found her after. But I know Julian was in this house that morning before I arrived, and I have never once had the courage to ask him what he did before I got there. I sat on the floor of that sewing room with that letter in my hands for a long time, and I understood, finally, the full shape of what my family had been living inside for over a year. Camille was guilty of theft, of silence, of 6 weeks of burning her mother-in-law's photographs out of pure animal fear. She had not, I now believed, killed my wife, but she had spent 14 months protecting the man who almost certainly had, because the alternative was admitting she had let a predator into our house in the first place, and because some debts, once you're inside them, feel more dangerous to escape than to keep serving. I photographed every page with my phone, replaced everything exactly as I found it, and drove straight to Ray's garage with my hands finally steady. We had two more pieces to put in place before we moved. The first was legal cover. Ray connected me that week with a retired county prosecutor he trusted completely, a woman named Deborah Okafor, who reviewed everything we had and confirmed what Ray had already suspected. The coroner's file, the trust transfer records, and the burner phone would be enough to reopen Eleanor's case as a homicide investigation, and enough to bring federal financial crimes investigators in on Julian Vance, provided we didn't spook anyone before local and federal law enforcement could coordinate a single simultaneous move. The second piece was Camille's own signature, and this is where 38 years of running a photography business finally paid me back for every contract I'd ever signed. 3 days after I found the lockbox, Daniel and Camille sat me down in the living room with a folder of new estate paperwork, telling me, gently, that given everything I'd been through since Eleanor's passing, it might finally be time to formalize Camille as co-trustee on what remained of the family accounts, just to simplify things going forward. I understood, watching Camille's hands tremble slightly around her coffee cup as she said it, that Vance was pushing her to close this out completely before either of them lost their nerve. I told them I understood, and that family should always come before pride. I told them I was tired, and grateful, and ready to sign. And when Camille slid the paperwork across the coffee table, I signed it the exact way I had signed every insurance liability waiver of my professional career for 30 years, without my middle initial, in the specific abbreviated form my own attorney, and I had registered decades earlier as valid only for non-binding preliminary drafts, a signature any competent estate attorney would recognize on sight as legally void, and any inexperienced one rushed and eager to close the file would simply file away without a second glance. Camille thanked me with tears in her eyes. I told her I loved her, and meant it more than I expected to, and went to bed that night having signed away nothing at all, buying us exactly the window of time Ray said we'd need. That window closed 9 days later, on the afternoon of Eleanor's long-delayed memorial gathering, a small remembrance in our backyard that Daniel had been asking me to hold for months, one I had kept postponing until I understood why I couldn't bring myself to stand under that oak tree and toast my wife's memory in front of the two people I now knew had spent 14 months erasing her. I finally said yes to the date. Deborah Okafor said yes to the timing too, for reasons that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the fact that Julian Vance had, according to the financial task force Ray's contacts had quietly assembled, flown in from out of state that same week to personally oversee the final transfer of the trust. The transfer my forged signature had already invalidated, though he didn't know that yet. 20 people stood in my backyard under string lights that evening, holding paper cups of lemonade and telling gentle stories about a woman most of them had loved for decades. And I stood among them in a gray sweater with a photograph in my breast pocket, the scorched one, the one Mia had pulled from a fireplace, waiting for a man I had never met to walk through my gate, believing he was about to close out the last loose thread of a plan 14 months in the making. He arrived just after 7, when the light had gone soft and gold and the backyard was full enough that one more stranger barely registered, a lean man in his 50s with an unhurried walk and an expensive watch, introduced by Camille to the handful of guests near the gate as an old family friend of Daniel's from the trust work, Julian Vance. He shook my hand when Camille brought him over, and his grip was warm and confident, and he told me he was very sorry for my loss, and I looked into the eyes of the man who had almost certainly stood in my basement 14 months earlier and told him it was a pleasure to finally meet him. Likewise, I said. I understand you've been very patient with our family's finances. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone almost before I could name it. Camille's hand tightened around her cup. I had asked Ray 3 days earlier to make sure that if we were going to do this, we would do it here, in front of witnesses, on ground I controlled completely, because a courtroom takes months to deliver a reckoning, and I had learned, sitting on those basement stairs with my hands shaking, that I needed to see this happen with my own eyes, while Eleanor's memorial candles were still burning on the table behind me. Deborah Okafor had made the arrangements. Two unmarked sedans were parked a block down the street. Ray was standing by the side gate in a windbreaker that didn't quite hide the earpiece underneath it. And in my breast pocket, next to the scorched photograph, I carried a small flash drive holding 14 months. If you counted every quiet hour Eleanor herself had spent building this case before I ever knew there was a case to build, of evidence. I waited until Daniel had finished his toast, until the string lights had fully taken over from the dying sun, until Mia had gone inside to help set out dessert, because whatever came next, I was not going to let my granddaughter watch it happen. Then I walked to the small table where we'd set out Eleanor's photographs, the ones that had survived, painstakingly reprinted from my own digital archive over the past 2 weeks. 41 images of a woman's whole life laid out under glass. And I picked up the scorched one from the center of the display, the one everyone at that party had assumed was simply weathered by time. "Julian," I said, loud enough that the nearest half-dozen guests turned, "I'd like you to see something. It's a photograph my wife left behind for me. It took me 14 months to understand what she meant by it, but I think you'll understand faster than I did." I turned it over, held it up, read the 9 words aloud into a backyard that had gone very quiet. The way Ray's earlier lesson had taught me, a room goes quiet right before something in it breaks. If anything happens to me, ask Arthur about the safe deposit box. Camille's paper cup hit the grass. Vance did not move, but something in his face went the particular gray color. Dr. Lynn's face had gone in a different family's story. The color of a man watching a structure he'd trusted for years reveal, all at once, that it had never been sound. "I don't know what you think that means," he said very evenly, "but I think it's time It means," I said, "that my wife spent the last 6 weeks of her life documenting every dollar you moved out of our family trust through a woman you'd already trapped in a debt she couldn't climb out of. It means the coroner's original file shows a contact wound on the back of her skull that has nothing to do with falling down a flight of stairs, and it means that 4 blocks from here, there are 2 federal agents and a detective from the county sheriff's department who have been listening to every word of this conversation for the last 90 seconds, because I am, as it turns out, still very good at hiding a small microphone inside something nobody thinks to look at twice." Camille made a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. Not a scream, something smaller and worse. The sound of a woman finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what her spine felt like without it. "I didn't touch her," she said to me, to Daniel, to the whole silent backyard. "Julian, tell them I wasn't even in the house yet, tell them." "Camille," Vance said, low and sharp, the first crack in his composure. I'm done not talking," she said, and turned to Daniel, whose face had drained of every ounce of color, whose hands were shaking around nothing at all. "I found the transfers your mother made. I panicked. I called Julian because I didn't know who else to call, because he already had me so far in debt. I couldn't see a way out that didn't end with me losing everything. And by the time I got to the house that morning to try to talk your mother out of reporting it, he was already there, Daniel. His car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, and I found her at the bottom of those stairs. And I have spent 14 months telling myself I don't actually know what happened before I got there, because knowing would have meant I had to do something about it." Vance moved for the side gate. Ray was already there. Windbreaker open now, bad-shaped credential in one hand that I would later learn belonged to a retired detective, still licensed to assist in an active investigation, and behind him, coming through the gate at a fast, disciplined walk, were the 2 agents and the sheriff's detective Deborah had arranged, moving with the kind of calm efficiency that told you this was not their first quiet arrest at a family gathering. It was over in under 2 minutes. Vance did not resist, which told me more about the kind of coward he really was than anything else that evening could have. Camille did not resist either, and when they walked her past me toward the gate, she stopped, just for a moment, and said the only thing she ever said to me that I fully believed. "I loved your granddaughter more than I ever loved the money, Arthur. I need you to know I never meant for any of it to touch her." I didn't answer. Some sentences don't deserve an answer at the moment they're spoken, They only deserve to be remembered accurately, the way I'd spent my whole life training myself to remember a photograph accurately, damage and all, without letting anyone talk me into believing the damage wasn't there. Daniel didn't move for a long time after they'd gone. He stood by the dessert table where his daughter had been standing minutes earlier, staring at the space where his wife had just been led away in handcuffs, and when he finally turned to me, his face had the look of a man watching his whole understanding of the last 6 years collapse into a single unbearable shape. "Dad," he said, "did you know this whole time? Did you know and you didn't tell me?" "I knew for 3 weeks," I said. "I spent every one of those 3 weeks trying to figure out how to tell you without breaking you completely, and in the end, I couldn't find a way, so I let Ray and Deborah build a case strong enough that you'd never have to take my word for it alone. I'm sorry, Daniel. I should have told you the night I found out. I let my own fear of losing you decide for both of us, and that was wrong of me, no matter how carefully I dressed it up as protecting you." He didn't answer that either, not that night. He sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs we'd set out for the memorial, next to a table of his mother's photographs, and put his face in his hands, and I sat beside him, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all. Somewhere behind us, string lights swayed gently over a backyard that had just watched a family come apart and, though none of us could see it yet, begin, slowly, painfully, the way every real restoration begins, to come back together. The weeks that followed were not clean, and I've come to believe stories like this one are only honest if they admit that. Julian Vance was charged with grand larceny, financial exploitation of an elder, and, once the amended autopsy findings were entered into evidence, second-degree murder, the physical evidence Ray had uncovered, combined with cell tower records, placing Vance's phone at our house 40 minutes before Camille's arrival that morning, was enough for a grand jury and enough, 18 months later, for a conviction. Camille testified against him in exchange for a plea on the financial charges alone. She is serving 3 years, not the decades Vance is now facing, and I won't pretend I feel nothing complicated about that arrangement. She helped bury the truth about my wife's death for 14 months. She also, in the end, chose to stop burying it in a backyard full of witnesses at real cost to herself. I have decided, slowly and without any real peace about it yet, to let both of those facts be true at once. Daniel didn't speak to me for 11 days after the memorial. When he finally came back, he didn't come with an apology, and I didn't ask for one. He came with a box, the last one, it turned out, that Camille had packed but never quite managed to burn, pulled from the back of a closet neither of us had thought to search, full of photographs Eleanor had kept of Daniel as a boy, birthday parties, and little league games, and one blurry, beloved shot of the three of us on a beach the summer he turned 7. We sat on my kitchen floor for 2 hours sorting through them together, the way I used to sort damaged negatives at my old light table, and somewhere in that second hour, without either of us planning it, we started talking about his mother instead of about Camille. And that was when I understood we were finally going to be all right. I visit Mia every Thursday now. She still keeps the scorched photograph, though it's been professionally rehoused in acid-free framing in my old studio's back room, the two of us working together most weekends. I'm teaching her, slowly, the same patient trade that saved her grandmother's last message from a fireplace. She asked me once, turning a damaged negative over in her small, careful hands the way I'd taught her, whether she'd done something brave that night she brought me the photograph. I told her the truth. I told her that some of the bravest things any of us ever do look, from the outside, like a 9-year-old girl quietly refusing to let something disappear. The trust has been restored, mostly through the federal recovery process, though some of what Vance moved offshore may never fully come back, and I've made my peace with that faster than I expected to. Money was never really what this story was about, not for Eleanor, not in the end for me. I sold the house last spring. I could finally walk past that basement doorway without my hands shaking, but I found I no longer wanted to. Mia and I chose the new photographs for the walls together. I keep one framed on my desk now, in the small studio I quietly reopened above the old space last fall. Not the scorched one, though that one hangs safely under UV glass in the front room where every restoration client who walks through my door can see what a photograph can survive if someone loves it enough to look closely. The one on my desk is newer. Mia took it herself. On the anniversary of the day she handed me that first photograph in the dark, the two of us standing together in the same backyard where everything finally came apart, and then, slower than either of us expected, came back together. Eleanor used to tell me that a good photograph doesn't just show you what was there. It shows you what somebody thought was worth saving. I spent 38 years teaching other people that lesson, one restoration at a time. It took my own wife, gone 14 months, and speaking to me from the back of a photograph she trusted I would eventually find, to finally teach it to me.